Good morning, my name's Tobias Pond, Principal at KTA, joined by Martin Allen, Project Architect and Associate on this project at Kerr Street. I've got a bunch of slides, I'm going to whiz through these as quickly as I can. It was working before, I promise you. I can click on the pathway for my... No, it's not working. Okay, great. So I'm going to start just by talking about the site. It's a site in Kerr Street, near Smith Street. It's a former McRobertson's chocolate factory building. This is one of a number of those buildings that occupied Fitzroy from late 1800s through to today. Many of them have been developed already into residential conversions. I think this is possibly the last one. This is the site in 1930. Our building's one on the corner in the foreground, and the one behind it is the old gold factory building, which is still there as well and has since been was converted to residential before we started our project. This one's been a slow burn. We first started in 2010 and have been through a few ups and downs, including a global pandemic, 3 engineers, 2 builders, and various other fun and games, VCAT. So architecture does take a while. And to prove that it's from a different time. That was our planning permit application, 12 pages, A3, mostly done by us. So if people want to know why architecture costs a lot more these days, there's a lot more people involved, I suspect. In terms of context, this is it when we started. You can see behind the white building is the old gold building, and those openings are windows from adjacent apartments looking over our site. We're relying on southern aspect across our site for their amenity. This is the same site from the rooftop, and you can see those apartments. At some point, someone decided that the right thing to do would be to turn our building to a car park. So they dropped a multi-level car park in behind the brick facade. So that's what we're working with. And that slab we largely retained and used in the new build. Really kind of inspired by the context. So you can see here that the adjacent corners, or the corners looking away from our site, are all kind of held quite tightly by brick lower level forms, actually quite high zero setback forms adjacent to that, and we're kind of keen to pursue that through the design. So this sort of talks about, so I'm just going to stop turning around. There we go. This talks about, I suppose our first instinct was that we've got this heritage base to Kerr Street and Gore Street, and that sort of low level brick facade was kind of mirrored on all corners, and so we wanted to retain that and sort of start with that. And clearly this is an adaptive reuse project. So we looked at that base, we looked at what the kind of maximum permissible form would be if you just extruded it right up from its boundaries. In truth, the planning overlay allowed us to go a bit taller than the adjacent building to the north. We ended up pulling that height down. We wanted to keep that northern building actually more dominant as a sort of a dominant street element for that corner. This is sort of the minimum you would do for a sort of light well to preserve amenity to those adjacent apartments. But clearly you end up with a floor plate that's way too deep for us to use anyway. So what we looked to do with the support of council was to actually develop a perimeter and have a perimeter block model with this kind of mutual benefit courtyard that actually is both great for our residents but also the adjacent neighbours. We then use that central space as a courtyard for gardens, which will eventually grow up and become amenity for both. Part of the perimeter block model was actually then how do you articulate that so it doesn't feel like this monolith in the streetscape. So we sort of broke up the blocks into 3 distinct wings, and then started to think about how you vary the heights of those blocks to address sort of southern aspects and views through from the street into the courtyard, as well as views out. Then, of course, the question of articulation. So how do you develop a facade strategy that responds without mimicking, which is not necessarily a complete juxtaposition from a heritage, but relates to it. So this is sort of clearly it's a project in our minds is a sectional project rather than a lot more than a planned project. So sort of starting with the sections, you can see the existing car park that was in the building, we've retained that. What we have done is replaced the car park ramp with a car lift to kind of reduce the floor area take. The heritage base, you can see on the left at the bottom there, is activated with two-storey townhouses. So they infill the former McRobertson factory building. And then we have this kind of clear separation and a break where we have the new dwellings above, which feature sort of 1, 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. You can see in the top left there, that's the west wing. We've got duplexes on the top floor. So it's sort of a variety of apartment typologies. All the apartments above the break, above the sort of the heritage base, are dual aspect, so they get light and air from both sides. This is a sort of north-south section through to Kerr Street, and you can see the kind of the depth and generosity of that courtyard that we're setting up for the residents to the north as much as it is for our own residents. In plan, we have the infilling of that heritage base with two-storey townhouses. You see the car park entry retained on Gore Street and the car lift in the middle. 2 lobbies, so there's an address to each sort of Gore and Kerr Streets. And every apartment on this level actually has a door to the street, which I think is really important, so it doesn't actually sort of isolate this building from its context. Going up the building, you can see how the first floor balconies are starting to set in behind the heritage facade, so they're not projecting, they're sort of set in and making use of existing apertures within the former factory building. This is the second floor plan, the kind of the first plan where we get the new build above the former heritage building. You can see it's sort of set up as 3 distinct wings with breaks defining each wing. Each building effectively is treated differently materially, and each break is then activated with a staircase that allows for kind of a breezeway staircase that allows for light, air and views in and out to sort of further break down the volume. As you go up the building, you can see the sort of mix of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments around this courtyard. The perimeter, the internal corridor courtyard is activated by an external corridor, which all the apartments use as their front door. And the southern apartments in the middle block actually have their balconies facing north into this space, which wouldn't be allowed under BADS today. We think it's actually quite a successful outcome. On the perimeter, we also have moments of relief for the residents. So you can see here sort of front doors and then benches that allow for residents to sort of dwell outside their apartment line and be social but not entirely in the public realm. There is a communal space on the top floor, sort of the 5th floor plan you can see here facing south, great views over towards the city, and then 2 further wings extend up to the 6th floor. And you can see on the left there that sort of the upper level duplexes. And so the corridor on the internal side, courtyard side, shifts from being a corridor to a balcony.